Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Keith Hall of the Congressional Budget Office to the stage.
Good morning. This morning I'd like to briefly discuss, let me get my slide stuff going here. I'll wait for a minute. There we go. All right, this morning I'd like to briefly discuss CBO's current budget projection. I'll start with our most recent budget projection, where we project government revenues and spending over the next 10 years if current laws governing taxes and spending remain generally unchanged from where they are today. After that, I'll discuss the trends in revenues and spending beyond 10 years, and I think you'll see why CBO has characterized the long-term trend in budget deficits as unsustainable. I'll then briefly touch on what is driving our projection of growing deficits and debt, the uncertainty in our projections, and then try to give you some idea of how much change in taxes and spending would be needed to impact our projection of the long-term debt picture. Oh, next slide. There we go. CBO's current 10-year baseline projection was released just a couple of months ago in March. The projection is based upon our most recent economic forecast issued in mid-January. In our forecast, we anticipated that the economy would expand solidly both this year and next, as remaining slack in the economy slowly diminishes. After that, we would have a more moderate pace of growth through the end of the 10-year period. Although we projected solid growth for this year, we are off to a slow start, as the early data on GDP growth for Q1 came in low at just 0.5%. Next. Thank you. This year, we project that the federal budget deficit will reach $534 billion, or 2.9% of GDP. This would be the first rise in the deficit since 2009. If you look on the graph, you can see that. I think I need to click it a couple of more times to get more of my lines out. Here we go. There we go. As we've noted in our monthly budget review, however, tax revenues are coming in for the first 4 months at rather lower than we projected, to give you an idea of where we are on this. If current laws remain generally unchanged over the next 10 years, we project that the deficit will continue to grow at about the same pace as GDP for a few years, but then begin to rise significantly, as you can see again on the chart, reaching $1.3 billion or 4.9% of GDP by 2026. Now that dashed line there tells you what the 50-year average deficit is, about 2.8%. So 4.9% is well above that already. Get my lines in. So why will deficit rise under current law over the next 10 years? Well, first, under current law, spending is projected to grow faster than revenues. We expect that revenues, if it's the green line here, will grow roughly at the same pace as GDP and remain above the 50-year average as a percent of GDP. That's the dashed line, the green dashed line below that. Spending, however, will rise faster than revenues, steadily increasing as a share of GDP over the 10-year period and moving further above its 50-year average. So you see the blue line moving well above the dashed blue line. There we go. Now we're working. So first, where do these rising outlays come from? We have, well, I went too far, sorry. There we go. So where do these rising outlays come from? We have 5 budget categories here. 3 of them are rising, 2 of them are falling. Spending on Social Security and major health care programs would rise through the 10-year period, accounting for 60% of the spending increase over that time period. Rising debt and rising interest rates would push net interest payments from 1.4% of GDP to 3% of GDP over the 10-year period. In contrast, the other 2 categories, other mandatory spending and discretionary spending, would decline relative to GDP. In particular, under current law, discretionary spending is projected to drop to just 5.2% of GDP. I'm sorry, I'm having trouble with my slides here. There we go. If you look at the discretionary line, it's the one that starts at the top, and you see that it falls below Social Security and major health care programs as a share of GDP over the 10-year period. And it will fall to its lowest share in 50 years. So we have a really significant drop in discretionary spending. Most of that comes from the fact that discretionary spending is capped through 2021 to rise slower than GDP. On the revenue side, although we project that revenues as a share of GDP will be flat, doesn't mean revenues are flat, by the way. It means they're rising, but no faster than GDP. The changes actually there's still some significant changes. They're just offsetting. In particular, over the 10-year period, individual income taxes would rise for a number of reasons, but the most important one is real bracket creep. And this is from having, as usual, taxable income rise faster than inflation. Since tax brackets are indexed to inflation, that will push more people into higher tax brackets. The other four revenue sources, payroll taxes, corporate income taxes, and Federal Reserve remittances, would decline over the period. Payroll taxes would decline in large part because of rising income inequality. Corporate income taxes would fall because of declining domestic profits. And Federal Reserve remittances would fall to something closer to historical averages after the recession. Now, it's worth noting that the tax rules that form the basis of CBO's projections include an array of exclusions, deductions, preferential rates, and credits that reduce revenues for any given level of tax rates. And those that provide assistance for particular activities, entities, or groups are considered to be tax expenditures. Now, if you look at this graph, the middle bar is the size of tax expenditures in 2016. To the left are the major categories of taxes. To the right are the major categories of spending. So you see tax expenditures are really quite significant. They amount to about $1.5 trillion this year, and that comes out to be 7.9% of GDP. And the largest effects on revenues from tax expenditures come from health insurance provided by employers and pensions. So now let's turn to our budget outlook beyond the next 10 years. After projecting the budget under current law for 10 years, what we do now is we extrapolate this trend to a longer time period. If current laws governing taxes and spending remain generally in place, the outlook for the budget would steadily worsen over the long term. And you can see here what that looks like. We project a substantial imbalance in the federal budget, with revenues falling well short of spending over the next 25 years. Now, we're in the process of updating these long-run projections, actually right now. We'll have a new, more detailed long-term projection later this summer. But this is a somewhat simplified version of that, taking the trends forward to about 2040. And if you look at this carefully, you'll see that, for example, starting in 2007, debt was about 35% of GDP. Now it's up to about 75% of GDP. In 10 years, it'll be 86% of GDP. And by 2040, it'll be 130% of GDP under current law. And one thing I don't want to forget, notice the slope of that line. It's 130% and rising. We extend it beyond that, this continues to go up very significantly. Let's talk briefly about uncertainty. Unfortunately, I don't have a lot of time to talk about uncertainty, but it's fair to say that even if future tax and spend policies remain the same, and they aren't changed over this long period, budgetary outcomes are clearly going to differ from our projections. And as unexpected changes in the economy occur, demographic changes, other factors occur, our forecasts or our projections not going to be exactly accurate. but we still forecast, under any reasonable scenario, rising and high long-term debt. And I want to talk about the main reason. Here again, the main components of federal spending. In the long term, federal spending is projected to rise noticeably relative to the size of the economy, in large part because of growth in spending for 1, Social Security, 2, major health care programs, and 3, net interest on accumulated debt. And the 2 most important factors driving this in order are the aging of the population and rising health care costs per person. And we project that there will be a continuing rise in health care costs even after adjusting for demographic changes, faster than GDP. And here's the aging population story. If you look on the left-hand side, you see the share of population above age 65 is going to grow significantly. And again, on the left, as the larger share of the population gets above age 65, we expect a larger share of the population will receive Medicare and Social Security benefits. But there's also a second effect. If you look on the right-hand side, not only do you have people moving into the 65 or over bracket, over time, they'll move into 75 or over and 85 or over. As this group expands, we expect the cost per person of health care over the long run to grow significantly. So it's not just getting above 65, but it's getting well above 65. It's going to increase the cost of health care and have a big impact on the budget. Now, this is going to have a significant impact on the composition of the federal budget in the future. I won't spend a lot of time with this graph. I'll make the slides available. But unless substantial changes are made to Social Security and major health care programs, together they will become more than double the average over the past 50 years. So they'll go from about 6.5% of GDP, which is the 50-year average, to about 15% of GDP by 2040. While other non-interest spending would be a smaller share of GDP, and that's what the budget will look like under current law in the long term, net interest would continue to grow, and by 2040, we project it'll exceed 5% of GDP. And you can just sort of imagine what sort of drag that is to have a 5% of GDP payment, net interest payment over time. I won't spend a lot of time on this graph, but this is the total revenues. And you'll see that total revenues start above the average and will rise over time under current law. And again, this is the individual income tax receipts growing. And most of this is from individual income taxes and that bracket creep that I talked about. I won't spend much time on this either, but this is a direct comparison of how things look on average, how things look now, and how things will look in 2040. The most notable thing here is on the bottom. The deficit right now is about 2.9% of GDP. In 2040, we project it to be 8.1% of GDP. So this is the point that it's not just that the debt is getting high, it's continuing to accelerate. Deficits are getting larger and larger, and they're adding more and more to the debt over time. And here's probably the most depressing graph, in my favorite graph. This is putting federal debt held by the public into historical perspective. And these numbers are the debt as a share of GDP numbers. All right. First, under current law, federal debt held by the public would top 130% by 2040, as you can see here. You can also compare it back to history. That's a level not seen before in U.S. history. It's higher than post-World War II. It's higher than any other time. And it's on an upward trend. And it's on an upward trend that could not be sustained indefinitely. And this trend, and this high level of debt, and this trend in the debt would have significant negative consequences. To just give you a little flavor of the negative consequences. First, it would reduce not only national savings, but it would reduce national income. So you're talking about lower savings, lower GDP growth, lower wage growth. Second, it would have increased pressure on the federal budget. What what budget makers are able to do as interest payments grow to a very high level. And third, this would limit lawmakers' flexibility to respond to unforeseen events and increase the likelihood of a fiscal crisis. And when I talk about responding to unforeseen events, if you look at this debt held by the public and go back to 2007, in just 5 years, the debt doubled from 36% of GDP to 75% of GDP because of the Great Recession. Now we're starting at 75% of GDP. If we have another recession, this is really going to limit flexibility on what to do about it by lawmakers. And the best we can say is that this is unsustainable. There's no figure at which debt as a share of GDP is just too high or it's become unsustainable. You really don't know where this becomes a real problem and where you're really increasing the likelihood of a fiscal crisis. But I would like to point out that nation's debt is already high by historical standards, and projected levels are unprecedented in our history going forward. We talk a little bit more about, I guess, the uncertainty in this. The baseline, that trend that shows the debt going up to 130% of GDP, that's our point estimate. You throw in uncertainty, it actually could be significantly higher than that, and it could be significantly lower than that. When we have our long-term budget outlook later this summer, we'll do a little more work on looking at what happens when you vary the values of key factors like interest rates and healthcare costs and productivity. I think it's safe to say, though, that by 2040 or in the long term, debt is almost certainly going to be as high as it is today, which is 75%, which is historically a very high level. But it's much more likely to be significantly higher than that. And again, our point estimate's 130%, and it could be more. And by the way, if we take it out further again, it goes up beyond 130% under current law. So what can be done? Lawmakers would have to make major policy changes to tax policies, spending policies, or both to make this path sustainable. The size of the changes would depend upon the amount of long-term debt that they consider to be acceptable. And it depends upon how soon they want to start making changes. Because obviously the longer you wait, the more change you have to make over time. And to give you some idea of how much change would have to be made to change this story, we have a couple of illustrative budget paths here. If you look at the one in black, that's our current extended baseline. Right? The one below it is, what if we reduce deficits by a total of $2 trillion over the next 10 years? So you make changes in the budget and you start to reduce deficits, and you save about $2 trillion off of the accumulated deficit over the next 10 years, and then sort of continue that over past that deficit reduction in the 10th year, just continue as a share of GDP. You would lower our projection from 130 to 97% of GDP. So that's a pretty significant change, and you're starting now, and you lower it to 97%, that's still a large number. If you double that, take it to $4 trillion over the next 10 years, which is a larger adjustment, that would hold the debt to about 65% of GDP. So that's getting relatively flat over time, but still very high by historical standards. So to give you some idea that this really requires quite a large change just to keep this somewhere in the ballpark of where we are right now. And at the risk of depressing you and walking off, I think I'm done. Thank you.